The IDF Chief of Staff is warning that a 7th of October style attack is being prepared against Israel, but this time from Syria. What is he talking about exactly? And is there relevant information to back these claims coming from the IDF Chief of Staff? Well, the Syrians, they were celebrating 1 year to the collapse of al-Assad several days back. Hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets, but that wasn't what concerned Israel. It was other events that took place on that same day, primarily when it comes to the armed forces of Syria. The armed forces of Syria were viewed chanting against Israel for Gaza, similar chants to Al-Qassam brigades in Gaza. And Israel viewed that as a warning sign, a direct threat that these forces are becoming more hostile towards Israel after they haven't really confronted Israel and its incursions in Syria. Neither have they responded to any of the attacks that Israel conducted inside of Syrian territories. So what is this about exactly? Well, now the IDF Chief of Staff is saying that there is a massive campaign that's about to happen. And after they viewed these scenes from the Syrian armed forces, they conducted a cabinet meeting to discuss the repercussions of that. Now they're saying dozens of trucks and hundreds of armed people are going to go inside of the Golan Heights and these areas. They're planning a large attack on us, and we need to be prepared for a surprise shock attack that's going to come very soon, particularly from Syria. Let's contextualize slightly. Israel has been attacking and invading Syria since the fall of Assad. No response came from the new administration. Perhaps in an attempt to defuse the situation, they did say we're not interested in war. They did manage to remove the sanctions of Syria. The salaries have quadrupled in Syria. 3 million Syrian refugees returned to their homes, and the economic situation is getting better. However, Israel is still playing more games and trying to cause more problems. And now, just recently, the talks between Israel and Syria about an agreement failed. Why did they fail? Well, it was Benjamin Netanyahu who refused to sign an agreement. We heard that recent reports said they reached a security agreement, not an overall agreement. They almost reached that agreement. But they told Israel, you're going to have to withdraw to the 1974 agreement borders, or pre-8th of December 2024, something that Israel refused to do. And they told them, we will not have a peace deal with you. A peace deal is something much bigger than that, and we're going to need to have the Golan Heights back. But now we're just talking about a security deal. But if you want a security deal and an understanding, you need to withdraw to the 1974 borders pre the 8th of December. The United States had similar reports that an agreement was almost there, but Netanyahu refused to sign. And after Netanyahu refused to sign, we started to see things deteriorate. There was this attack in Beit Jan where several armed people targeted Israel in that area, an Israeli incursion. Several Israelis were wounded, some of them critically wounded, according to some reports. Israel started to say that these people are being armed by both Hamas and Hezbollah, according to Israeli sources who are quoting some Arab sources. They don't have proof, but this is what they're saying. And everything is going downhill. But one of the biggest things that happened in recent weeks was the fact that the Ministry of Defense inside of Syria declared that the borders and border control is now going to be under the supervision and control of the Ministry of Defense. The Minister of Defense of Syria mentioned that in a recent interview he had on television. He said that now the control is going to be with the Ministry of Defense rather than the Ministry of Interior. What does that mean exactly after all of these moves that took place and this military display that even had paragliders similar to how Hamas attacked Israel and chants against Israel for the sake of Gaza, and like the Palestinian resistance all of a sudden coming from Syria, and now with this declaration that the border control is going to be in the hands of the Ministry of Defense rather than the Interior Ministry. Well, moving the control of the borders from the Ministry of Interior to the Ministry of Defense has several meanings, and very significant meanings. And some of these meanings are, well, number one, there's a militarization. So the border protection is moving from a police style to a full-blown military style. That means there's military tactics, surveillance, more soldiers being deployed, higher readiness for conflict scenarios. The second very important thing is that the government is believing that the border threat is a national security level, and they are taking it at that level. Then they're going to plan to also increase centralization and secrecy without sharing too much information with several bodies in the country. And it's a massive sign as well that there are growing tensions. There's a very big border dispute because Israel isn't only occupying the Golan Heights, it also occupied several other points close to the Golan Heights. This is also a message, international message, that we are taking a harder line now. The games are over, at least from what we understand from these moves. What happened on the ground that reflects these developments? What exactly happened that reflects these developments that happen? Well, for one, the Israeli army had an incursion in near Al-Qunaitra area, which is next to the borders with the occupied Golan, and into Syrian territories. They went and had a checkpoint, and that checkpoint was meant to prevent the armed forces of Syria from reaching that area, only for the armed forces to arrive when Israel was there, as we can see in this video over. As you can see, these are the Syrian armed forces, and on the corner over there is an Israeli military vehicle. They didn't have an altercation, but they passed and they were chanting against them and going beyond the line that Israel wanted to have this checkpoint in. These could be a translation, or this move could be a translation of the Ministry of Defense to move some of its forces closer to the border. There were no direct clashes from the Syrian security forces against Israel so far, but the moves that they're conducting are raising the tensions now because they're finally having some responsive measures against Israel, albeit after accomplishing certain things in the international scene, and also things to do with lifting the sanctions, something that led Donald Trump himself to send a message to Israel: let nothing happen that will disturb Syria. This happened after the clashes took place in Beit Jan, when Israel had this incursion, killed several innocent Syrian people, and there was a response from the Syrian people that the government backed and said that we have a right to defend ourselves. And at the time when we spoke about it, we spoke about the fact that it's quite unlikely that they're only, armed people without any sort of training or government backing, because it was a very cleverly calculated ambush at the time that took down several Israeli occupation soldiers, Zionist occupation soldiers in that area, which indicates that they had the intelligence, they had the means to monitor, they had the live intel, and they also carried out a successful ambush. All of that indicates that, well, from an Israeli perspective, well, they have been conducting all of these aggressions against everyone, really. From the Syrians' perspective, they had an approach of non-escalation for a while that they realized isn't completely working, especially after they exhausted the negotiation path that led to, well, no results, typical with Israel. But now it reached a situation from their perspective that they started to take certain actions on the ground without crossing all of the lines so far, but nevertheless, escalation coming from the Syrian side. And that is primarily due to the fact that the Syrians, well, if they want to rebuild their country, and the country is destroyed to a very large extent during the years of conflict and war in Syria, over 1 million Syrians were killed, 14 million refugees, 250,000 people missing. Now 3 million went back. But to rebuild, you need to have security. You need to have political stability, something that Israel isn't giving Syria and doesn't want to give the Syrian people. So from the Syrian perspective, this could be a move to say that, okay, well, if you do want to escalate, we'd rather that escalation happens now, because with all of the destruction, we don't have much more to lose before we rebuild. And if they start rebuilding, they wouldn't want to be in a situation where they would be facing another Israeli aggression to destroy all of what they have built so far. From an Israeli calculation, there are several things to consider. The first thing is Benjamin Netanyahu is under the pressure of Donald Trump in the case of Syria. When it comes to Syria, it's not only about Syria and the Syrian people. There have always been regional and global players. American forces are still in Syria, or the Russian forces are still inside of Syria, and the Gulf states have an interest in Syria. Turkey, of course, has a very big interest in Syria too. So there are several factors to consider, but one of the most prevalent things is the disagreement that Donald Trump has with Benjamin Netanyahu. That even came in his statements and also with the statements of Tom Barak in relation to Syria. Secondly, Benjamin Netanyahu is not going to be there for very long. Netanyahu has just under a year now, unless Israel goes on early elections. And during that time, he might want to do something with Syria, but his hands would still be tied. From a Syrian perspective, they're trying to push that as much as possible to see where any escalation would lead to with Israel, whether it will come to an all-out war at one point, or it will reach to a level where Israel would realize that, okay, these people are actually serious. The period that they were quiet in didn't mean that they weren't willing to fight Israel, for example. But now that they showed willingness, and Israel, again, when they had all of their armed forces going to the border area that Israel wanted to be completely demilitarized, they did nothing to them. And there is pressure here coming, not only from the United States, but from other countries too. However, from an Israeli perspective also, they have been a country that has done so many things that were completely illogical. Of course, the crimes, the barbarity, but the scale of stupidity in all of the actions when it comes to the Israeli government and how much harm they've done to the image and reputation and legitimacy of the occupation entity proves that they are also capable of committing something very stupid and also igniting another large-scale war with Syria included.